Welcome to our comprehensive analysis. Today, we are turning our attention to a subject that is often discussed, in headlines in doctors' offices, but it's rarely understood in its full systemic complexity.
It's a topic that affects nearly every aspect of human health, yet the public understanding is often quite superficial.
Exactly. We are talking about a condition that has shaped human history, it's fundamentally altered our understanding of physiology, and it currently stands as one of the most significant and, frankly, growing challenges to global health. We are talking about diabetes mellitus.
A name that many people have heard, but few could likely define accurately.
Right. And before we get into the mechanisms, the history, or the new genetic typologies, I want to start with the sheer scale of what we are dealing with here, because the numbers are not just rising, they're fundamentally changing the landscape of human biology.
It is a scale that is difficult to overstate. We are witnessing a fundamental shift in the health of the global population.
The trajectory is what I find most alarming. If we look back to the global data from, say, 1990, which historically isn't that long ago at all.
Just over a generation.
Exactly. We saw approximately 200 million people living with diabetes. That was already considered a global crisis at the time.
It was.
But if we fast forward to the data available in 2024, that number has exploded to 828 million people worldwide.
An incredible figure.
It's more than a fourfold increase in just over 3 decades. To put that into perspective for you, that is a population larger than the entire continent of Europe, all united by a single metabolic dysfunction.
And it represents about 1 in 7 adults globally. It is currently ranked as the 7th leading cause of death worldwide based on the 2012 mortality data. But even that statistic requires significant context.
Why is context needed there? Is that ranking somehow inaccurate?
It's likely a significant underestimation.
A significant one. How so?
Because diabetes is often the underlying driver for other fatal conditions. When a patient dies of kidney failure or a cardiovascular event like a massive heart attack or a stroke, the death certificate will list those organ failures as the primary cause of death.
Ah, I see.
It often masks the fact that diabetes was a precipitating factor. It was the chronic high blood sugar that destroyed the blood vessels in the kidneys or the heart in the first place.
So the 7th leading cause is really just the tip of the iceberg.
Precisely. The true mortality rate is buried in the statistics of other diseases.
So the true impact is hidden in the data. And there's another statistic that I saw in the literature that suggests a vast number of these 828 million people are walking around completely unaware of their status.
That is correct. And it is perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the current epidemiology.
The silent nature of it.
Exactly. Approximately half of the people living with diabetes are undiagnosed, they are asymptomatic, or their symptoms are mild enough to be ignored or attributed to other things, like aging or stress.
So while they're going about their daily lives, the damage is already being done.
That's the critical point. The physiological damage, the vascular erosion, the damage to nerves and organs is occurring silently, sometimes for years, before a diagnosis is ever made.
Which is why this investigation is so important. We need to move beyond the surface-level idea that this is just high blood sugar or a problem with eating too many sweets. We need to understand the biography of this disease. But let's start at the very beginning with the name itself. The etymology actually gives us a very graphic, almost mechanical description of what the disease is.
It does. The term diabetes comes from ancient Greek. It was coined by Apollonius of Memphis around 230 BCE.
230 BCE, so we've known about the symptoms for a very long time.
Millennia. And the word itself literally translates to siphon, or to pass through.
A siphon. That creates a very vivid, almost industrial image.
It refers to the most obvious symptom observed by ancient physicians: the excessive discharge of urine. They observe that the body effectively becomes a siphon, taking in fluid and immediately expelling it, seemingly without any absorption.
Just passing right through.
Yes. The second part of the name, mellitus, was added much later in 1675 by the physician Thomas Willis.
And mellitus is Latin for
honey sweet.
So if we combine them, the clinical name diabetes mellitus literally means a siphon of honey.
Precisely. It describes the condition where the body is siphoning off sweet, sugar-laden urine. It is a crude but chemically accurate description of the end-stage result of the disease.
That is our starting point. Our mission today is to conduct a comprehensive exploration of this sweet siphon. We're going to look at the physiology, the different topologies, including several you have likely never heard of, like type 3C and type 5, the history, and the modern management of the disease.
It's a complex and multifaceted condition.
Absolutely. Let's begin with section 1, the physiology of glucose regulation. To really grasp what goes wrong, we need to understand how this system is supposed to work when it is functioning correctly.
To understand the pathology, we must first understand the baseline physiology. In a healthy body, the process begins with the ingestion of food. The body breaks down carbohydrates into glucose, which then enters the bloodstream.
And this glucose is the body's main fuel.
It's the primary fuel source for the body's cells. It is, the gasoline for the engine. However, glucose cannot simply enter most cells on its own. It requires a transporter, a key.
This is often described using the lock and key analogy. Is that still the best way for people to visualize it?
It is a simplified but still very accurate analogy. The cell membrane is locked. It's impermeable to glucose in its resting state. The key that opens the door to allow glucose inside is the hormone insulin.
And insulin is produced in the pancreas.
Correct. It's produced and released by specific cells in the pancreas called beta cells. These are located in clusters known as the islets of Langerhans.
So let's trace the process. You eat a meal, your blood glucose levels rise, and these beta cells detect the increase.
And in response, they release insulin into the bloodstream.
The insulin then travels to the cells all over the body, unlocks the door, and glucose moves from the blood into the cell to be used for energy.
That is the process, yes. And there is a counterbalance to this system which is just as important.
The off switch, so to speak.
You can think of it that way. If blood glucose levels drop too low, for example during a period of fasting or between meals, the pancreas releases a different hormone called glucagon.
So insulin lowers blood sugar, glucagon raises it.
Correct. Glucagon signals the liver to release its stored glucose, which is known as glycogen, back into the bloodstream to maintain equilibrium. It is a very tightly regulated feedback loop designed to keep blood sugar within a narrow, safe range, ensuring the brain and other organs always have a constant supply of fuel.
So diabetes occurs when this very specific, very elegant mechanism breaks down.
Yes. The breakdown occurs in one of two main ways. Either the pancreas stops producing enough insulin, meaning the key is missing from the system, or the body's cells stop responding to the insulin.
So the key is there, but the lock is jammed.
Exactly. That state is known as insulin resistance.
And regardless of which mechanism is at fault, missing keys or jammed locks, the immediate physical result is the same: hyperglycemia.
Hyperglycemia, high blood sugar.
The glucose is stuck in the blood because it simply cannot get into the cells where it's needed.
And that excess glucose in the blood is what triggers the classic triad of symptoms, often referred to in medical texts as the 3 Ps. These are the red flags that have been recognized for centuries.
Let's walk through these 3 Ps so you can understand the chain reaction. The first one is polyuria.
Polyuria is excessive urination, as we mentioned regarding the siphon name. This happens because the kidneys have a certain threshold for how much glucose they can reabsorb back into the body.
They can only handle so much.
Right. When blood sugar rises above that threshold, the kidneys are overwhelmed, and they effectively dump the excess glucose into the urine. Now, glucose is osmotically active.
What does that mean, osmotically active?
It means it pulls water with it. It's a basic principle of chemistry. So as all that sugar leaves the body in the urine, it drags a significant amount of water out with it.
Which leads directly to the second P, polydipsia.
Polydipsia, which is excessive thirst. Because the body is losing so much fluid through polyuria, the patient becomes severely dehydrated. The blood volume drops, the salt concentration of the blood rises, and the brain's thirst mechanism is triggered intensely to try and replace that lost volume.
It's a thirst that you can't quench.
It is a thirst that is very difficult to quench because the underlying process of fluid loss is still happening.
And the third P is polyphagia.
Polyphagia is excessive hunger. This is a paradoxical symptom.
It seems very counterintuitive. The blood is full of sugar, which is energy. Why would you be hungry?
Because that sugar cannot enter the cells due to the lack of insulin action. So the cells are essentially starving. The body perceives a state of starvation and signals the brain to eat more to bring in more fuel, even though the blood sugar is already dangerously high. You are eating, but the energy isn't reaching its destination.
Aside from these 3 classic signs, there are other symptoms that might be less obvious, but are equally indicative of the condition.
Yes. Patients often report blurred vision. This isn't permanent damage, at least not initially. It's caused by fluid shifts affecting the lens of the eye. The high sugar in the blood changes the shape of the lens, which alters its focus.
So it's a direct mechanical effect.
It is. There is often unintended weight loss, particularly in what we call type 1 diabetes, as the body begins burning its own fat and muscle for fuel since it cannot access the glucose. And fatigue, of course, is very common for the same reason. The cells simply have no energy.
And there are biological markers that are quite specific, almost sensory in nature, that people might notice.
One distinct sign is a sweet, fruity odor on the breath or in the urine. It smells a bit like acetone or nail polish remover.
Why that specific smell?
This is related to the production of ketones, which are a byproduct of fat metabolism. We'll discuss that in more detail later. Another common sign, particularly in undiagnosed cases, is the susceptibility to fungal infections, such as candida.
Yeast infections.
Yes. High sugar levels in bodily secretions provide a perfect breeding ground for yeast, leading to symptoms like chronic genital itchiness or oral thrush.
Having established the mechanism and the symptoms, we need to complicate the picture a bit. Most people are aware of type 1 and type 2 diabetes, but the typology of diabetes is actually far more nuanced than just those two categories. The sources indicate it's more of a spectrum of different diseases. Let's start with type 1 diabetes to set the baseline.
Type 1 diabetes accounts for approximately 5% to 10% of all diabetes cases. It is fundamentally an autoimmune condition.
So the body is attacking itself.
Correct. The body's immune system mistakenly identifies the beta cells in the pancreas, the insulin factories we discussed, as foreign invaders and systematically destroys them. This results in a complete or near-complete lack of insulin production.
It used to be called juvenile diabetes, but my understanding is that this term is no longer considered accurate by the medical community.
That is correct. While it is the most common type diagnosed in children and adolescents, the term juvenile diabetes is obsolete.
Why is that?
Because the onset can occur at any age, including in adulthood. We see diagnoses in people in their 30s, 40s, and even later. Calling it juvenile is misleading and can lead to misdiagnosis in adults.
There is a very interesting statistic regarding the genetics of type 1. We often assume autoimmune conditions are purely genetic, but if you look at identical twins, the concordance rate is only about 50%.
That is a crucial point for understanding the etiology of the disease.
What does concordance rate mean here?
It means that if one identical twin has type 1 diabetes, the other twin only has a 50% chance of developing it, even though they share the exact same DNA.
Which seems low. If it were purely genetic, you'd expect it to be much higher.
You would expect a concordance rate near 100%. The fact that it is only 50% implies that while there is a strong genetic susceptibility involving certain HLA genotypes, genes alone are not enough, there must be an environmental trigger.
Something in the environment has to pull the trigger on that genetic predisposition.
Precisely. We don't know exactly what that trigger is, though there are hypotheses. They include viral infections, like enteroviruses, or perhaps early dietary factors in infancy. However, no single virus has been definitively proven to be the cause in humans. It remains one of the central mysteries of the disease.
Now contrast that with type 2 diabetes.
Type 2 is by far the most prevalent form, accounting for about 95% of all cases. Its primary characteristic is insulin resistance.
So this is the jam lock scenario.
Exactly. The pancreas is producing insulin. In fact, it's often producing too much of it initially to try and compensate. But the cells in the muscles, fat, and liver are not responding to it properly. Eventually, after years of overworking, the pancreas may burn out and stop producing enough insulin. But the root cause is the resistance at the cellular level.
And unlike the often sudden, dramatic onset of type 1, type 2 is described as insidious.
Yes, it is slow and gradual. A person can have prediabetes or even full-blown type 2 diabetes for years without noticing any overt symptoms. The damage is cumulative and silent.
When we look at the risk factors for type 2, we see a very different profile than type 1. We know obesity, specifically visceral fat, is a major driver.
It is the single largest risk factor.
But going back to the twin studies, the results for type 2 are actually quite surprising compared to type 1.
They are very counterintuitive to what most people expect. In type 2 diabetes, if one identical twin develops the condition, the risk for the other twin is significantly higher than what we see in type 1.
Higher.
Much higher, often approaching 70% to 90%.
That's fascinating. We think of type 2 as the lifestyle disease, but this suggests genetics play an even bigger role than in type 1.
It indicates that while lifestyle is the driver we talk about most, the genetic component, the heritability of type 2, is actually very, very strong.
Yeah.
It is a combination of a high genetic predisposition colliding with powerful environmental factors like diet and sedentary behavior.
Let's move to the third major category, gestational diabetes.
This form occurs specifically during pregnancy and affects somewhere between 2% and 10% of all pregnancies. It is a temporary condition for the mother, but one with serious implications.
What's the mechanism there?
During the second and third trimesters, the placenta produces hormones that are crucial for helping the baby grow. But these hormones are also insulin antagonists.
They block the action of insulin.
Yes, they block the mother's insulin. In most pregnancies, the mother's pancreas can overcome this resistance by producing extra insulin. But if it can't keep up, her blood sugar rises, and she develops gestational diabetes.
And this carries risks for both the mother and the child.
Absolutely. For the fetus, the high sugar from the mother's blood crosses the placenta. It acts as a growth promoter, leading to a condition called macrosomia.
A high birth weight.
A very high birth weight, yes.
No.
This can cause significant complications during delivery, such as shoulder dystocia or the need for a C-section. The infant may also suffer from respiratory distress syndrome after birth.
Then what about for the mother after the pregnancy?
For the mother, while the condition usually resolves after she gives birth, having gestational diabetes marks her as high risk for the future. It increases her risk of developing type 2 diabetes later in life by about tenfold. It's a major warning sign.
Now, this is where we get into the territory that the average person likely does not know. The classification of diabetes is evolving. There are types that do not fit neatly into the type 1 or type 2 boxes. Let's discuss LEDA.
LADA stands for latent autoimmune diabetes in adults.
Latent autoimmune.
Yes, it is essentially type 1 diabetes. It is autoimmune, the same antibodies are present, but it develops much more slowly than the classic childhood presentation. Because it appears in adults, usually over the age of 30, it is frequently misdiagnosed as type 2.
I have heard this referred to informally as type 1.5.
That is the unofficial term, yes. It's a useful shorthand. These patients are often started on type 2 medications like metformin. But because the underlying cause is the autoimmune destruction of their beta cells, those medications eventually fail. The patient isn't resistant to insulin, they are losing the ability to make it.
So eventually they need insulin therapy.
Eventually, they will require insulin therapy, just like any other type 1 patient. Proper diagnosis is key to avoiding delays in appropriate treatment.
Then we have Modo Gray.
MODY stands for Maturity Onset Diabetes of the Young. This is distinct from all the others because it is a monogenic form of diabetes.
Monogenic, meaning a single gene is responsible.
A single gene mutation, yes. Unlike type 1 or type 2, which are polygenic involving multiple genes and environmental factors, MODY is caused by a mutation in one specific gene. It constitutes about 1% to 2% of all diabetes cases.
And it runs in families very strongly.
Very strongly. If a parent has it, there is a 50% chance their child will inherit it. It's often milder and, importantly, frequently does not require insulin. Some subtypes can be managed effectively with oral medication alone.
We also have a category called type 3C.
Type 3C is pancreatogenic diabetes. This is diabetes caused by direct physical damage to the pancreas itself.
So it's not autoimmune or strictly metabolic. It is a structural problem with the organ.
Exactly. It could be from chronic pancreatitis, often from alcohol abuse. It could be from cystic fibrosis, which damages the pancreas, or hemochromatosis, which is iron overload, or even surgical removal of the pancreas for cancer. If the organ is physically damaged or removed, it simply cannot produce insulin.
And there is a newly recognized category that appeared in the 2025 reporting in our sources, type 5.
This is a significant development in the classification, and it's mostly seen in low-income and developing nations. Type 5 is malnutrition-related diabetes.
How does malnutrition cause diabetes?
It involves decreased insulin production, similar to type 1, but it is not caused by autoimmune antibodies. It is caused by severe chronic malnutrition, particularly in youth, which affects the proper development and function of the pancreas.
So the organ itself is just underdeveloped.
In essence, yes. But the key clinical differentiator is that unlike type 1 patients, those with type 5 typically do not develop ketosis or ketonuria, that buildup of acidic ketones. Their physiology is broken, but in a unique way driven by scarcity, not autoimmunity.
That is a critical distinction. And finally, before we leave typology, we should mention the controversial type 3.
This is an unofficial term, not yet a formal diagnosis. It's used by some researchers to describe insulin resistance specifically in the brain.
Insulin resistance in the brain.
Yes. They are investigating the very strong link between metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, and Alzheimer's disease. The theory suggests that Alzheimer's could essentially be a form of diabetes, affecting the brain's ability to process glucose for energy.
which would starve the brain cells.
and lead to the cognitive decline and plaque formation we see in Alzheimer's. While it's still a research concept, the overlap in the underlying pathology is striking.
That brings us to Section 3, the biography of the disease. We have defined it and categorized it, but how long have we known about this condition? It seems this has been with humanity for a very long time.
It has. The biography of diabetes dates back to ancient Egypt. The Ebers Papyrus, written around 1500 BCE, contains what is believed to be the first written reference to the condition.
1500 BCE. That's over 3,500 years ago.
It is. The papyrus describes a state of too great emptying of the urine. It was a mysterious wasting ailment to them. They knew the symptom, but not the cause.
Moving forward to the 6th century CE, Indian physicians made a fascinating observation regarding the diagnosis. They didn't have chemical test strips, so they used nature.
Indian physicians in that era classified the disease as madhumeha.
Madhumeha.
What does that translate to?
It translates to honey urine.
So they knew it was sweet.
They did. They observed that the urine of these patients attracted ants. This was a primitive but highly effective diagnostic tool. If the ants gathered on a sample of urine, the sugar content was high.
That's incredible, and they took it even further.
They were also astute enough to distinguish between two different types. They described one associated with emaciation and rapid death in youth, which we would now call type 1, and another associated with being overweight and gluttony, which is clearly type 2. They recognized the duality of the disease 1,500 years ago.
In the Roman Empire, Galen, who was one of the most prolific medical writers of antiquity, commented on it as well. Galen referred to it as diarrhea of the urine, a very direct, if unpleasant, description. However, interestingly, he noted that he had only seen 2 cases in his entire career.
Only 2 cases. For such a prominent physician.
Yes. This strongly suggests that the prevalence was vastly lower in the ancient world compared to today. This was likely due to major differences in diet and physical activity, or perhaps because people simply died of other causes like infections before the disease could fully manifest. It was a rare curiosity, not a global pandemic.
There is a description from Aretaeus of Cappadocia in the 2nd century that I found particularly haunting. He described the disease not just as urination, but as a physical transformation of the body.
Yes. Aretaeus provided a very grim, very accurate description. He wrote that diabetes was a melting down of the flesh and limbs into urine.
A melting down of the flesh.
It perfectly captures the wasting effect of untreated type 1 diabetes. Without insulin, the body cannot use sugar, so it begins to break down its own muscle and fat for energy. The waste products are then excreted. The patient literally consumes themselves to survive until there's nothing left.
And for most of human history, that was the reality. The pre-insulin era was essentially a death sentence.
It was. Until the 20th century, there was no effective treatment. A diagnosis of what we now call type 1 diabetes was fatal. Patients would simply waste away and die, often within months of their diagnosis.
What did doctors even try to do?
The only management was essentially starvation diets, severely restricting all calories to lower blood sugar. This only prolonged the inevitable by a very small, very painful margin.
That all changed in a pivotal moment in 1921 and 1922.
That was the breakthrough. A team of Canadians, Frederick Banting and Charles Best, working under J.J.R. MacLeod at the University of Toronto with the help of biochemist James Collip, managed to isolate and purify insulin from the pancreases of dogs and cattle.
And they used it on a human patient.
They successfully treated a 14-year-old boy named Leonard Thompson in January of 1922. It is considered one of the greatest miracles in medical history.
To go from a certain death sentence to a manageable condition.
It turned a terminal, rapidly fatal disease into a chronic, manageable condition almost overnight. Later in the 1940s, we saw the development of NPH insulin, which was long-acting, and that further improved the ability to manage the condition.
Let's shift our focus to the present day. We established in the intro that the numbers are exploding. We are looking at Section 4, epidemiology and risk factors. Where is this explosion happening? Most people would probably guess the West.
The popular narrative is that diabetes is a disease of the wealthy West, driven by excess and fast food. However, the data contradicts this. The fastest increase in prevalence is occurring in low to middle income nations, particularly in Asia and Africa.
This is linked to what is called the nutrition transition. Can you explain that concept?
The nutrition transition describes a predictable shift in diet and lifestyle that occurs as nations develop and urbanize.
So as people move from farms to cities.
Exactly. Populations move from active agrarian lifestyles to sedentary urban environments. Simultaneously, their traditional diets, which are often plant-based and rich in fiber, are replaced by Western-style diets.
Diets high in processed foods.
Energy-dense but nutrient-poor foods, high in processed sugar, saturated fats, and refined carbohydrates. This rapid shift creates a perfect storm for metabolic disease in populations that may not be genetically adapted to such high caloric loads.
Within a place like the United States, we also see significant disparities. It is not an equal opportunity disease.
No, it is not. There are profound racial and ethnic inequalities. For example, the data shows that Hispanic and Latino adults have a greater than 50% chance of developing type 2 diabetes in their lifetime.
A 50% chance. That's a coin flip.
It is. African Americans are also at a significantly higher risk compared to non-Hispanic white Americans.
The situation with Asian populations is particularly unique because it challenges our assumptions about obesity being the primary driver.
It does. We typically associate type 2 diabetes with a high body mass index, or BMI. We have a visual stereotype of who gets this disease. However, Asians tend to develop diabetes at a much lower BMI than other racial groups.
Why is that?
It's due to differences in body composition. At the same BMI, Asians tend to store more visceral fat, that's the dangerous fat around the internal organs, compared to, say, Caucasians, who might store more subcutaneous fat, the fat under the skin.
So a person of Asian descent might look thin on the outside but still have the metabolic profile of someone with obesity on the inside?
Precisely. And consequently, an estimated 1 in 3 Asian American cases goes undiagnosed. They do not fit the visual stereotype that doctors might be looking for, so the disease is missed until complications arise.
Socioeconomic status also plays a massive role in this.
Absolutely. The data is very clear. The rates of diabetes-related emergency room visits are double for low-income communities compared to high-income ones.
Which points to a lack of preventative care.
It reflects a lack of access to consistent primary care, a lack of access to healthy food living in so-called food deserts, and a lack of safe spaces for physical exercise. Poverty is a major carcinogen, and in this case, a major diabetogen.
There is one other risk factor that I want to highlight because it connects the physiological to the psychological. That is the impact of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs.
This is a profound and relatively recent area of investigation. Studies now show that adverse childhood experiences, which include things like physical or emotional abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, increase the risk of developing type 2 diabetes later in life by 32%.
A 32% increase. Is there any specific type of ACE that is a stronger predictor?
Yes. The research indicates that neglect specifically has been identified as having the strongest effect of all ACEs on future diabetes risk.
That's fascinating. What's the proposed mechanism?
It suggests that early life trauma becomes biologically embedded. The chronic stress response, chronically high cortisol levels, alters the HPA axis, and the way the body handles stress and metabolism for the rest of that person's life, sometimes decades later.
Moving on to Section 5, complications. We know high blood sugar is bad, but why? What does it actually do to the body to cause such systemic damage? Let's look at the acute emergencies first.
In the short term, there are 2 major life-threatening emergencies. The first is diabetic ketoacidosis, or DKA. This is most common in type 1 diabetes.
This is when we get that fruity acetone smell on the breath.
Exactly. Because the body has no insulin, it cannot use sugar for fuel. It panics and switches to burning fat at a very rapid rate. The byproduct of burning all that fat is ketones. When ketones build up in the blood, they make it acidic. The blood's pH drops to dangerous levels.
And this leads to symptoms like the Kussmaul breathing we mentioned, those deep, labored breaths. That is the body trying to fix the problem.
It's a desperate physiological attempt to balance the pH. The body is trying to blow off carbon dioxide, which is an acid, to counteract the metabolic acidosis from the ketones. It can lead to coma and death if not treated urgently with insulin and fluids.
And the second emergency?
The second emergency is hyperosmolar hyperglycemic state, or HHS. This is more common in older adults with type 2. Here, blood sugar gets incredibly high, much higher than in DKA, causing extreme dehydration and hypernatremia, high sodium levels.
So without the ketones?
Without the significant acidosis. The person becomes confused, lethargic, and can slip into a coma. It is equally life-threatening.
Those are the immediate threats. But the long-term damage is what affects the 828 million people living with this chronic condition. It essentially boils down to damage to the blood vessels, correct?
Yes. Chronic hyperglycemia is toxic to the vasculature. Sugar is sticky. It undergoes a process called glycation, where it attaches to proteins and damages the delicate lining of the blood vessels, the endothelium. We divide this into microvascular damage to the small vessels and macrovascular damage to the large ones.
Let's look at the specific organs affected by this microvascular damage. First, the eyes.
Diabetic retinopathy. High sugar damages the tiny blood vessels in the retina at the back of the eye. They can lead fluid or become blocked, starving the retina of oxygen. The body then tries to grow new, fragile vessels that bleed easily. It is currently the leading cause of new cases of blindness in working-age adults.
Not just a leading cause, but the leading cause.
In that demographic, yes.
Next, the kidneys.
Diabetic nephropathy. The kidneys are essentially intricate filters made of millions of tiny blood vessels. Diabetes destroys these filters. Over time, the kidneys lose their ability to filter waste from the blood. It accounts for over 50% of all patients currently on dialysis in the United States.
Half of all dialysis patients are there because of diabetes.
That's correct.
The nerves. This is one of the most debilitating aspects.
Neuropathy. High blood sugar is directly toxic to nerve cells, and it also damages the tiny capillaries that supply blood to the nerves. This usually starts in the longest nerves first, so it affects the feet.
Leading to a loss of sensation.
A loss of sensation, numbness, tingling, and pain. A patient might step on a nail or develop a blister from their shoe and not feel it. Because blood flow to the area is also poor due to vascular disease, the wound doesn't heal properly. It can become infected and develop into a non-healing ulcer,
Which can lead to amputation.
This cascade is the most common cause of non-traumatic lower limb amputation.
We also mentioned the brain earlier regarding the type 3 theory, but there is a confirmed link to dementia as well.
Yes, having diabetes, particularly type 2, significantly increases the risk of all-cause dementia, including both Alzheimer's and vascular dementia. The data indicates that the earlier the age of diagnosis, the higher the eventual risk of developing dementia. The vascular damage simply extends to the brain.
And even our hearing is affected.
There's a documented link between diabetes and sensorineural hearing loss, likely due to vascular damage to the blood vessels of the inner ear.
Finally, in the context of recent global events, we have to talk about infection risk.
Diabetes compromises the immune system. High blood sugar impairs the function of white blood cells. We saw this clearly during the COVID-19 pandemic. Prevalence rates of COVID-19 in diabetic populations were reported as high as 35.5%, and their outcomes, hospitalization, ventilation, death, were significantly worse.
And it's not just viruses.
No. Diabetic patients are also more prone to bacterial and fungal infections, gallstones, and other infectious complications.
It is a systemic assault on the entire body, but it is manageable. Section 6, Management and Treatment. We've come a long way since the starvation diets of the 1900s. Let's start with lifestyle.
Lifestyle remains the cornerstone of management, particularly for type 2 diabetes. Regarding diet, there is no single best diet that works for everyone. However, several eating patterns have strong evidence behind them.
Like the Mediterranean diet.
The Mediterranean diet, the DHH diet for hypertension, and low-carb diets are all cited in the clinical guidelines.
Is there one that stands out in the evidence for blood sugar control specifically?
The American Diabetes Association notes that reducing overall carbohydrate intake has the most evidence for improving glycemia. But, and this is an important point, for overweight patients with type 2, any diet that achieves meaningful weight loss is effective. The weight loss itself is what improves insulin sensitivity.
Then we have medications, a whole arsenal of them now.
Metformin is still the first-line oral therapy for type 2. It primarily works by lowering glucose production in the liver. Then we have a class called sulfonylureas, which essentially squeeze the pancreas to make it release more insulin.
And there are newer classes that work in different ways.
Yes. A major newer class is the SGLT2 inhibitors. These work on the kidneys to force them to excrete more sugar in the urine, essentially inducing a therapeutic polyuria to lower blood sugar.
And for type 1, it's always going to be insulin.
Yes. For type 1, the body makes no insulin, so it must be replaced. The gold standard is the basal bolus regimen.
Can you break that down?
It's designed to mimic the natural function of the pancreas. A long-acting insulin is taken once or twice a day to provide a background or basal level of insulin. Then a separate rapid-acting insulin is taken as a bolus with each meal to cover the carbohydrates in that meal.
There are also surgical interventions. Bariatric surgery is well known for inducing remission in type 2. There is a specific surgical treatment for neuropathy called nerve decompression.
This is a fascinating and somewhat controversial area. The theory is that in diabetes, nerves are swollen due to metabolic changes. When a swollen nerve passes through a tight anatomical tunnel, like the carpal tunnel in the wrist or the tarsal tunnel in the ankle, It gets compressed.
The same way anyone can get carpal tunnel syndrome.
The same mechanical principle, yes. So the theory is that by surgically opening those tunnels, decompressing the nerve, you can relieve the pain and symptoms of neuropathy.
And can it restore feeling?
Proponents argue that it can relieve pain and, crucially, restore sensation. Restoring sensation is key because that allows a person to feel an injury, which can prevent ulcers and, in turn, prevent amputations.
We should also mention transplants.
Pancreas transplants are an option, but they're usually reserved for very severe, difficult-to-control type 1 cases. They are often performed simultaneously with a kidney transplant in a patient who has lost kidney function due to diabetes.
Technology is playing a larger role, too, with things like continuous glucose monitors and telehealth. But the sources note that the evidence for the effectiveness of telehealth on actual biological outcomes is still mixed.
That is correct. While telehealth is convenient for follow-ups, the data does not yet uniformly support it as being superior for actually lowering HbA1c, a key marker of long-term blood sugar control, compared to standard in-person care. The evidence is still inadequate in many areas.
We are approaching the end of our exploration, but we have one last segment that I think provides a very different and surprising perspective on the disease. Section 7. Diabetes in the animal kingdom. Humans aren't the only ones dealing with this.
No, we are not. Many mammals and even some reptiles can develop diabetes.
But not all animals.
No. Interestingly, birds do not seem to get diabetes.
Why are birds immune?
Birds naturally have very high blood glucose levels compared to mammals, levels that would be fatal for us. They have evolved an unusually high tolerance for hyperglycemia, so the physiological damage we see in humans from high sugar simply doesn't occur in them. Their cellular machinery is different.
But our common household pets, dogs and cats, are very susceptible.
They are, and the presentation differs by species in interesting ways. In dogs, females are twice as likely to be affected as males. And certain breeds, like miniature poodles, Samoyeds, and Cairn Terriers, are at high risk. Cats are the opposite of dogs. Males are more prone to diabetes than females. And feline diabetes bears a striking resemblance to human type 2 diabetes. It is very often linked to obesity and insulin resistance.
Are there specific cat breeds at higher risk?
Yes. High-risk breeds include the Burmese, Russian Blue, Abyssinian, and Norwegian forest cats.
It is remarkable how these patterns, from breed predispositions to the link with obesity, mirror our own.
It reinforces that this is a fundamental biological process, a conservation across species that is heavily influenced by the interplay of environment and genetics.
Let's move to our conclusion and look at the future outlook. We started with 828 million people. Where is this trajectory going?
The projections are sobering. The International Diabetes Federation estimates a 48% increase in cases between 2017 and 2045. We are looking at a future where the burden of this disease will continue to grow, particularly again in the developing world.
It seems that diabetes is not just a medical condition, but a symptom of how we live on a global scale.
That is the broader implication, I think. If you look at the determinants globalization, urbanization, aging population, sedentary work, the rise of processed food diabetes is a mirror of modern civilization. It is the biological consequence of the world we have built.
That is a heavy thought to end on. While the science has advanced so much, from using ants for diagnosis and starvation diets to genetic subtypes and nerve decompression surgery, the fundamental challenge remains massive. It requires us to be aware not just of sugar, but of the complex interplay of genetics, environment, and society that defines this condition.
Absolutely. Awareness and understanding are the first line of defense.
Thanks for listening.